Hey everybody, great to have you back here in the fish tank. It is Minion Masters meta. Time. So we're looking at the meta for Premades in version 2.7. Remember, this month we're doing the separate videos for each of the modes, so solos, randoms, Premades, and draft. And today we're looking at Premades. Reminder, this is the meta overview of the leaderboard. The only data we have access to from the game is from the leaderboards. And just a kind reminder, if you're new here, please consider subscribing. If you're already a subscriber, please consider giving us a thumbs up, get involved in the comments. A lot of work goes into these videos and it really does help if you guys can support that. Right, let's look at the Premades meta. Right, so let's look at the Masters first of all. Two graphs here. On the left, we got last season 2.6, and on the right, this season 2.7. So we can see last season, it was Ratbo, Stormbringer, and then Tronvir. And this season, it's even more Ratbo, even more Stormbringer, and then Tronvir. So Ratbo and Stormbringer are way above everything else. Over 50% of the decks were either Ratbo or Stormbringer. One of the things to mention is we can't tell from the leaderboard which decks play with each other. But from my experience, on the top level, Ratbo and Stormbringer or Ratbo and Tronvir are the choices up there. So, Stormbringer saw the biggest increase. We can see it's gone up from 18 to 24%. Ratbo has gone up from 22 to 28%. So, even more of what we saw last season. Ratbo's likely getting a nerf in the next patch. Sorry if I gave you a heart attack there. Where the squeak attack will only affect your scrats, not the ones from your teammate. And of course, if more people are playing Ratbo and Stormbringer, then they're playing less of something else. So Volko's dropped off quite a lot. Apep again down there only in 4th place. Valorian, Ravager also dropping off quite a lot. So that's the master meta for Premades this season. Basically just Ratbo, Stormbringer, or Tronvir. And of course, the average mana cost hasn't changed much, 3.6 to 3.7. And a reminder, if you're new to the game, just build a deck between sort of 3 and 4.5 average cost for a basic deck. And we can see, if we just look at the least played masters, we've got, it looks like Ravager. I'm not sure what that tiny little slither is there. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. Might be Setsu squeezed in there somewhere. Very little Setsu being seen. Okay, so Masters, Ratbos, and Tronvir, and Stormbringer in between those. Let's have a look at the cards. So we're going to look at the top cards, non-spells, so that's minions or buildings, and then we'll look at the spells separately. So, reminder, if you're not familiar with these slides, they have a color code. The border tells you if the cards increased, decreased, or stayed the same in rank. And they've got a couple of numbers. The top left number is its current rank, and the top right number is its previous rank. So Swarmers, number 1, previous number 1. It's black, which means it hasn't changed. Whirly Scrat, number 2, up from number 14 last season. An Elite Swarmer, number 3, down from number 2 last season. So a few little changes there, but of course when we're talking about Premades or randoms compared to solos, cards that have AoE effects, area of effects become more important, damaging more than one minion at a time. For example, like the Crystal Arcanist there, very cheap AoE. Whirly Scrat, decently tanky, melee AoE. Defenso Chopper, kind of the same thing. And we'll see that even more when we look at the spells in a minute. So Whirly Scrat's seen the biggest increase overall. We've also seen some more Wild Stonebjorn out there, some more Crystal Arcanists, some more Aimbot, and some more Drone Buzzers. So that probably goes along the lines with more Stormbringer and therefore more of these ranged minions. If we look at what's dropped off a lot, Wogosaur Pop dropped off the most. Of course, that got nerfed with its Poison Spit in the last patch. Shield God of Light dropping off, Bounce Free Flingers dropping off, Lone Scout and Propeller Scrats seeing a reduction there. And a reduction in Propeller Scrats, maybe a reduction in King Puff, potentially. Only 5 of the top cards here are legendary, with 17 of them being common. So reminder, you don't need a deck stock full of legendaries to be solid out there. And a quick look at what cards weren't used at all. So we got the Zealots of the Burning Fist. Interesting there because they're very strong in solos, but not at all in 2v2. Void Altar, Protocol Assassin, Nazara, Thelic, Ghast, Brothers of Light, and Azog are amongst the unused cards. Unused non-spell cards in Premades on the leaderboard this season. But of course we have a lot of things in there that we're familiar with. Defenso Chopper in there at 10th. Cleaver in there at 7th place. Wartrack Dreadnought still in there. 13th, dropping down from 6th, but still a thing to be reckoned with, especially at perk 3. It can be a real pain. Just its staying power, its HP, can really make bridges difficult to deal with. Okay, so those are the top cards. Let's have a look at the top spells. And as mentioned, we start to see more AoE spells, more heavy power removal spells compared to solos. So things like Beam of Doom, we're not going to see too much in solos. Blade Star, we don't see too much in solos, and so on and so forth. So we can see Beavalanche is still the #1 top choice, even though it did get nerfed in the last patch. Remember, it still does the damage. It still slows the minions' movement speed whilst they're in it, but it does not affect their attack speed. It does not give a permanent slow anymore. So just goes to show how strong that card is. Despite the nerfs, it's still in there, but it is the card with the biggest play rate reduction. So still first, biggest play rate reduction. So that shows how powerful, how much it was used previous to that. So the top spells, we've got Beavalanche, Chain Lightning, Daggerfall, Poison Strike, Blade Star, Beam of Doom. Poison Strike's seen quite a big uptick, which I'm not too surprised about. Remember, we are in a Slither season, the new Ankahesh card, the spiders that are not spiders. Wheel of Doom seeing some more play rate along with Monitor Nats. Blade Star going up, likely to get a duration nerf in the next patch, and some more Lash of Armoon. And then if we talk about the cards that have seen biggest reductions, as mentioned, Beavalanche in there. Magma Storm's fallen out of favour, and I feel like Magma Storm was really meta when the Wartrack was super meta, but then things have changed. Beam of Doom still up there in 6th, but dropping down a little bit, and Rimagal's Breath also dropping out there. And again, only one legendary in the top 27 spells, and I think from looking at that, that's going to be the Hypnotize. So again, you don't need decks full of legendaries. And there was one unused spell in Premades. Can you guess what it is? Pause the video, put it in the comments. What is your guess? Okay, welcome back. You've unpaused the video. The unused card, unused spell card in Premades was Once Bitten. Okay, so let's have a look at the top legendaries. Always interesting, especially for newer players who are desperate to get their hands on some of these legendaries. But of course, remember, legendaries are not the be-all and end-all in Minion Masters. So, legendary of choice, Chief Icebreaker Bolf. Last season was 2nd. This season he's 3rd. Wartrack Dreadnought still up there, dropping down from 1st to 2nd though. And Karmic up there, maintaining its position at top 3. One of the newer cards, or the newest cards, added to the game. Zip Zapinator, Xiao Long, Lady and Frey. Lots of familiar faces there at the top. If we look at the increases, Xiao Long's seen the biggest increase in play rate. Wheel of Doom as well. Stormy, we're seeing a lot more Stormy compared to before. You can see it's in 13th place, gone up from 45. Was it in the last patch it got buffed? Maybe. So it attacks very quickly now. Chief Icebreaker Bolf also seen a big increase in its play rate, along with Simulacrum, interestingly. But what has gone down? Fergus has gone down the most. Rimagal's gone down also a lot. So has Chisma, so has Scotty, so has Razor Squadron. And there are 4 unused legendaries in Premades. We've got the Protocol Assassin, not a surprise. Nazara, not a surprise. Lord Sentinel Thelic, not a surprise. And again, Azog. Azog seems very out of favour in all of the modes. Okay, so that gives you an idea of what are the strongest masters. You know, if we extrapolate what are if a deck is on the leaderboard, it's a good deck. The higher up the leaderboard, the better the deck it is. We can use that to assume what are the strongest masters, what are the strongest cards. But of course, we combine those two things into the top decks. And as you may have seen in the previous video, we've got the top deck for each master. But of course, not all decks are created equal. There's going to be a lot of Ratbow decks, a lot of Stormbringer decks, a lot of Tronvir decks, and we're going to have to go down quite a long way to find some of the other masters. But it should give you an idea of the deck building for each of the different masters. And when we're talking about the top deck, we're looking at decks overall based on where they are on the leaderboard and the rank of the cards that they contain. So it should be a strong deck with strong cards. Right, so we see Ratbow, and one thing to mention again, as we kind of alluded to before, with Premades and looking at the leaderboard, we can't tell which decks play with which other decks. So, you know, some of these decks will have weaknesses, but they'll be made up with their partner deck, with the specific build for that. You know, some decks always play with a specific deck, other decks just play with whatever people want to play with. And remember, there's no wild cards, no common cards between decks anymore in Premades. Right, so Ratbow, this is very likely to be using the Ratbow alt perk. Squeak Attack doesn't have much Horde in there, so the Dakka's not going to do too much. So I think that's a fair assumption to make. Nice, cheap cards. We've got, of course, we've got the Swarmers, Tantrum Throwers, Slitherbound, all cards with horizontal spread that you can play directly on a bridge, so good bridge grabbing. Divine Warriors, always powerful in 2v2s, and then it's got some power in the form of the Cleaver and the Chief Icebreaker both. Right, deck 2 here is a Tronvir deck. Again, similar start to the deck. We've got these cheap bridge grabbing units. Defenso Chopper is pretty strong in the meta, especially with lots of Ratbow out there. And then we've got the power cards, the Dreadnought, the Cleaver, and again, the Bolf. Stormbringer, as you would expect, we start to see more ranged units, very likely to be taking advantage of Stormbringer's default perk. The alt perk, the Cloud Cover, isn't very good. And this is an aimbot deck, and the reason we say that is because obviously the aimbot requires tech to improve it. Tech you get from other Outlander cards, so we've got the Annihilator, Drone Buzzers, Vulture Prime, and Plasma Marines in there to generate the tech for the aimbot to get it so it's going to be fully shielded, ranged, and with the Nats on it. It does have the Magma Storm as a heavy removal spell. Don't hate that at all. There's a little bit of randomness, of course, with the Magma Storm, but if you play it smartly, you can minimize that as much as possible. Right, next up we have Wrecked, which is kind of surprising to see Wrecked so high up in this list, since we very rarely see Wrecked in 2v2s. But this must be a decent list, probably taking advantage of the Mass Illusion, I would imagine. So we've got some cheap cards. Flame Imp, of course, good. The Fire Imp, good as the AoE removal. Laser Turret to deal with the big units. Stormy did get buffed. And then we have to go all the way down to the 5th deck here to find our first APEP. But again, just a control APEP. This will be using the default perk with the 3 2-mana cards. Cheap cards, bridge grabs, removal spells. Well, actually, I'll tell a lie. Now I've got further into this. This is clearly using the Slave Driver, because we have Slithering Summons, we have Rabid Prowler. Those 2 Slither cards will want Slithers attached to them to trigger them. So yeah, this is a Slave Driver. I was mistaken, my mistake, my apologies. So that's the alternate master perk where you get the Slithers attached to your cards. Right, so let's have a look at the next page. So we've got King Puff here. Standard King Puff deck, of course, we've got the Tantrum Throwers to give rage. Well, I say that, we don't have the Propeller Horde in here, which is quite surprising. I would normally expect to see that in there. We have lots of split units, so we can get those bridge grabs and those Night Puffs. Bevalanche, as we've seen, the #1 spell, and the power of the Recordator, and Chief Icebreaker both. Next up we have Diona. It's a red golem deck, so you want to be taking that self damage to trigger the red golem. So we've got the Gax there, we've got the Brutish Betrayer, both of which will cause self damage. The Gax will damage the master, and the Brutish Betrayer, of course, has the Blood Pact. Blood Pact getting nerfed, I think, in the next patch, going up from 75 to 85% damage passed on to your master. So kind of a different kind of Diona deck there. Next up we have Mordor. This is kind of an interesting Mordor deck because you can see it's not full of heavy units. Wartrack Dreadnought is mythic, so that's not a revivable target either. So this could be a Mordor using the Deathless Tombstone, the alt perk, where you're reviving your opponent's stuff rather than your stuff. But again, we could only just kind of guess at it based on what we're seeing from it. But interesting there. Right, next up we have Morelia, and as you can see, it's not an accursed Morelia deck. So here we have just the cheap control units. The Veilstalker I do think is pretty good in 2v2s. It's the slow means it can put pressure on a bridge for a long time. Here again we have the aimbot. Interestingly, we don't have too much tech in here for the aimbot, which doesn't seem ideal to me. That means that you're going to often have the aimbot without... Well, I guess we have the Beam of Doom. Assuming you're using the beam, then you're probably going to be okay. But if you're not cycling the beam, then maybe not so much. And remember, Morelia with her spellbook reduction, 4+ mana spells, but you need 3 spells to take best use of it. This only has 2, so again, maybe not quite ideal depending on how you're playing it. Right, next up we have Volko. Again, it's an aimbot deck. We have the Outlanders in there to generate the tech for it. Skeleton Crew, that's a good bridge grab unit. And of course we've got the power of the Wartrack Dreadnought, and of course Volko giving the Rage. What we don't know is, are they using the alternate master perk for Volko? Are they using the standard one to get the Berserker Rage on the minions, their melee minions, or are they using that one-time all-in push perk 3? Unsure. Right, next up we have Milloween. As you would expect, some spells in the Milloween deck to synergize with the Master, and of course with Jinlong, making Jinlong jump and come back and stun. So we've got cheap Arcane Ring, Bridge Buddies. Arcane Bolt, remember that got reworked a little bit recently, so if it doesn't kill something, it doesn't cost you 5 mana, it only costs you 3. You don't have to pay that 2 mana freeze. So just kind of a relatively cheap spell-based deck for Milloween there. Valorian, interesting here to see Valorian playing Smite, but that's going to be an unactivated Smite. There's not enough Empyreans in that deck from the looks of it to trigger it. So that's interesting to use that Smite. Won't have that Holy Fire on the ground to do that extra damage. But again, cheap units, control, and then power. Next up we have Setsu. Probably had to go a long way down in the list to find this Setsu list. And let's have a look. Setsu, of course, has that spell synergy, so we will see spells in there. Very aggro here. We've got Gax, we've got the Gorak Brutes, we've got the Rammer, Scrat Launcher, Zeppelin Bomber, Beam of Doom, Dragon Ball. So yeah, very aggro deck, which you probably need a teammate that's playing a similar kind of thing, because if one of you's playing sort of control and the other's playing super aggro, they can kind of cancel each other out. So it'd be interesting to see what that deck plays with. And then finally we find a Ravager deck here. Again, another fairly aggro deck, using the Resonating Construct and the Resonating Blast Crystal. Not something we see too often, but seems to be working out for them over there on the leaderboard. Right, so those are our top decks for 2v2 Premades. Now the next thing we're going to do is very quickly go through the top cards for each of the Masters. There's a lot to cover. We won't go through it in depth, so if you want to look at these slides, just pause the video and screenshot it, whatever you need to do. So just very quickly, these are the top cards for Apep in Premades. You can see quite a lot of Slither stuff in there. Top cards for Diona in Premades. Nothing particularly sticking out there. Top cards for King Puff. We start seeing more multi-minions to generate those Night Puffs. Not really sure if people are using the Mimic Magic alt perk or not. I haven't really used it. It hasn't been something I've enjoyed too much. Milloween. Interestingly here, Milloween seems to be a lot of accursed Milloween decks. You see a lot of accursed cards at the top. And reminder, if you look at the bottom there, you can see how many decks this data is taken from to give you an idea of how representative it is. So 18 Milloween decks that we've been able to get some information from there. Whereas here you can see Mordor, there's 59 decks. Mordor, of course, we start seeing heavier units, get those good revives. But as we've seen, people potentially using the alt perk for Mordor, so not having to necessarily have that restriction. Morelia here. And Morelia not dominated by accursed cards, which is definitely something that it would have been in the past. We do still see Harmful Souls, Nirvir's Breath down there on the second row, but not the top played cards. Next up we have Wrecked, followed by Ratbow. Again, you still see the Horde in there, the Scrat Horde, but maybe less of it because the Daka is not really being played so much, so the Horde is not used. So, just cheap cards. Of course, you get a lot of bridge control from that Squeak Attack perk too. Ravager, start seeing heavier cards in here. Ravager kind of likes to do some big aggro pushes. They seem very heavy indeed. And then next up we have Setsu. This slide looks broken, but this is because there was, if you look at the bottom, there was only one Setsu deck for us to take our data from. So this is just one deck. This is the deck that was found in Premades that Setsu was playing, and it's a very aggro deck. Right, next up we have Stormbringer, and as you'd expect, we have lots of Outlander range, lots of Crystal Elf ranged minions. Here we have Tronvir. Tronvir kind of goes with anything, so not really too many synergies to speak of there. And Valorian. We've seen definitely some Empyrean cards in here. We've got High Marshal Rystar there in 7th place. Ardent Aegis, the top played card as well. And then we have, finally, Volko. And Volko definitely likes to have these big, heavy-hitting units to get the rage on. And as you can see, that's what we're seeing here. Okay, so I know we went very quickly through that last section, but we don't want to make this video too long, so make sure you check that out at your leisure. Reminder, a lot of work goes into these videos, so if you are enjoying them, please consider subscribing, thumbs up, getting involved with the comments and stuff like that. It really does help. But yeah, let me know in the comments, what do you think? What we're seeing here, is this representative of what you're seeing out there? Remember, we're only looking at leaderboards, so depending on where you're at, what your level is, you may be seeing different stuff. But hopefully this is interesting as well as useful. My name's Bad as Fish, and I'll see you again soon here in the fish tank.